Okay, this is going to be something of a change of pace. Up until this point, people have been talking about the science that they're actually using blue waters for. And in Professor Voth's group at the University of Chicago, we're running many different things on there, and 20 minutes didn't really seem like a fair explanation of many of the things that we're doing. So instead, I'm going to talk about a piece of software that we've been developing specifically for the blue water system that we're using for many of these projects instead. Because, you know, it's a huge system, and we thought, well, molecular dynamics, it's a fairly conventional technique. There's many different people using it, there's many software packages available, but we had certain sort of specific needs for MD that weren't really met by the existing software, and we thought, well, great, there's this enormous machine, let's take a step back and see if we can actually think about what we might do if we really wanted to push these simulations to very large scales. And the primary driver behind this was this idea of an ultra-coarse grain model. So conventional atomistic MD, you typically have all of the water in there explicitly, you have all of the atoms in there explicitly, and you can make the simulations more efficient by removing degrees of freedom in there. So, you know, you can maybe get rid of the explicit water molecules and somehow incorporate their effects with an implicit solvent model. You can start to collapse, for example, residues in proteins together to make a simplified protein representation that's more computationally efficient and so on. And right at the top of my little hierarchy here, we have an ultra-coarse grain model, which the idea is we put lots and lots of information into each of these coarse grain beads, such that the model is extremely simple, but importantly, these beads themselves are no longer static. There's actually chemistry occurring inside the beads, whether that's some sort of a Markov state model or some sort of environmental dependence on the interactions. The beads themselves are no longer some sort of a static entity with a fixed interaction that's going on here. So we have various ideas at work, you know, loop folding, ligand binding, various types of catalysis going on inside the beads, which is actually affecting their fundamental nature, how they interact with other things in the system. So to be able to run these sorts of simulations, there's certain things that you need in your modeling code, and although the existing sort of molecular dynamics programs like NAMD, LAMP, Scromax, whatever else, has some of these aspects, none of the codes we've really looked at have all of them, and hence, you know, you don't really want to be reinventing the wheel, but sometimes there are situations where it makes sense to do so. So in brief, the major components that we needed were the dynamic sort of runtime environment where we could actually change the nature of these coarse grain beads dynamically as and when we needed them. You know, we could change the resolution of molecules, we could add and remove things very, very easily. We needed low memory requirements because if you're using such aggressively coarse grain models, it makes sense to be able to push things up to enormous scales, like the scale of cells, basically. We're talking about microns and higher. We need dynamic load balancing. When you get rid of the solvent, the model runs a lot faster, but you have these big empty spaces, and if you try and use the sort of naive domain decomposition where you're chopping up your simulation into these small subunits, and each of the CPU cores handles all of the calculations in a subunit, these big empty spaces can really be a problem. And we wanted it to be flexible too. I mean, I use lamps a lot in the past, and the reason I like lamps is it's really, really flexible. It's dead easy for hacking with. If you have some sort of peculiar model you want to try, it's really easy to do it in things like lamps. And although codes like NAMD are extensible in the sense that you can use tabulated potentials and you can use things like Tickle boundary forces and things like this, it's not really easy to fundamentally get in there and start changing what's going on. So to combine all of these different aspects, we thought, let's take a step back and see how we would design an MD code for these very large scale, very aggressively coarse-grained systems. So the basic design principles, which I'm not really going to talk about, is that all of the communications are non-blocking. We don't do this idea of just waiting for incoming data. You always try and do some work while somebody else is sending you information. And for strong scaling on these systems, where you really want to push these simulations out to loads of CPU cores, you don't ever want to be waiting for information, because there's a potential that something somewhere might interfere with one of the processes and everything stalls as a result. It's bad news, you don't want to do that. Really big systems, we're still talking about molecular level, so we want to be using parallel input-output, because otherwise, you know, you could take ages to actually read and write the data files. Not a good idea. I have problems with using MPI-IO that I'm not going to go into, but we ended up using something else. All of the internal data, flat array, so we can put it onto GPUs, we can use accelerator cards very easily. We don't have these sophisticated internal data structures that are quite difficult to use in some respects. It's portable, self-contained. We don't want to be supported by any other libraries that could be potentially difficult or problematic to build on various supercomputers, even though we designed it for Blue Waters. You know, I have access to things like the BlueG machines working at Argonne National Labs. It's self-profiling. One of the things that bugs me about parallel software is so often You don't know why it's running slowly. It's just, it doesn't scale properly, and you don't really know why. And the last thing you want to be doing is using one of those parallel profilers on a really, really big system. I've tried all of the different types of parallel profiling, and it can just be painful when you're pushing up to hundreds of thousands of cores to actually deal with this information. I always like the idea that the program you're running itself should tell you what's going wrong. You know, if there's a problem somewhere, it should be able to tell you that itself instead of relying on you learning to use these sort of sophisticated tools. What I am going to be covering in this talk is 3 of the key aspects that we're really hoping are going to let us push up to these huge scale simulations and have the dynamism in there. So these are template data, which gives us these sort of dynamic simulation contents and also reduces the memory overheads. Some other memory reduction techniques, which again is very useful for these big simulations, and load balancing for the parallel efficiency. I'm not going to go into a huge amount of data because we did actually publish a paper recently here, which has some of the sort of technical nitty-gritty in there if anybody's interested to see this. But onwards, we have this idea of template subunits and template assembly. So you describe your simulation in terms of what an individual sort of indivisible subunit might be. Anybody who's used the charm force fields will be familiar with this approach because the topology files actually do something very, very similar. So for example, amino acid in a protein is listed in there separately, and then you have some way of combining these independent subunits to create some sort of overarching structure. So the simplest sort of subunit you could have is just some sort of a molecule in there, and that molecule will internally contain one example of the sort of bonds and angles and dihedrals and all of these things you need for the internal molecular structure. On top of this is the idea of assemblies, which let you sort of knit these subunits together by adding additional topological information, your bonds, angles, changes, and maybe the way they interact, these sorts of things. And the advantage of doing this sort of an approach is we no longer have to have input files where you're exhaustively listing all of the bonds and all of the angles and all of the dihedrals and all these things in advance. The code calculates this stuff dynamically. So all you need is basically a definition of what the subunits are, what these assemblies might be, and the code will take care of it for you. You no longer have to run it through a preprocessor that spits out these enormous input files that are just full of indices that's very difficult to read. You can't really modify these things, and they're a little painful to use sometimes. The global non-bonded exclusion lists that say that these things are bound together, so you don't necessarily want any sort of non-bonded interaction occurring, is again all inside of the templates information that you have there. So this gives you quite small and simple input files. I mean, they're human readable, you can pretty much see what's going on straight away, and the software will take care of all of the background knitting together of these various aspects for you. And this is nice because it means you can change things at runtime, because it's regenerating all of this information dynamically. It means that we can spontaneously switch the types that we have in the subunits, we can change various aspects of the simulation, and it will just trigger an internal rebuilding of the data. So you don't need to worry about stopping the simulation, somehow modifying the input file, loading it again, and starting off all the simulation again. Because when you're actually running these very large simulations over lots and lots of cores, one of the nasty things about them is the actual startup time for the simulation can be minutes. So if you have something occurring inside your simulation that's maybe happening with a frequency of once every 5 seconds somewhere in the simulation, the last thing that you want to be doing is stopping the simulation, somehow regenerating some sort of an input file that reflects a change, then loading that in and running the simulation again, because most of your time is then not spent actually doing the calculations, it's spent just booting the system up again. So this gives us a great deal of flexibility as to what we can do at runtime. And a quick example of this, because it's not always straightforward what I'm talking about, if we imagine that we define what the atoms are that we're using at the top of the file here, so we have a set of atoms with names, masses and things like this involved, and then we sort of register some topological types like a harmonic bond, harmonic angle, dihedrals, these sorts of things, then we know what the fundamental building blocks we're using in the system is. At that point we can say, well, what's a subunit? A subunit consists of these coarse-grained particles. You give them a type, which we referred to before, and you give them a local naming convention for use inside this subunit definition. Then we just define some sort of local topological connections, some sort of local interactions and things like this that are inside that subunit, and then we have everything we need at runtime to start actually generating all this data dynamically. So the idea of an assembly, it's exactly the same, only instead of using coarse-grained particles, we're defining things in terms of subunits. And we're actually saying, subunit 1.3, where 3 is one of the local particle names, has a certain bond with something else in there. And again, that's really, in principle, all the information that you need to build these quite sophisticated overall molecular topologies that you have. And again, you can add and remove these things at runtime. So if you had some sort of a conformational change in a protein, for example, it might be very different structures. Maybe you'd use an elastic network model that had these sort of different parts of the protein as subunits, but their overall connections that give you the different conformation might be an assembly that you can switch on and off or change the type at runtime. And another problem that you have when you're running very large simulations can be the use of memory. The use of the template data definitely decreases the amount of memory that you need, because you no longer need these sort of overall global lists of things. You can generate that dynamically. But there are some subtle problems at work to do with how the internal sort of molecular dynamics program works in terms of how it uses the memory. So you need to know which particles might be interacting with other particles, and the fast way of doing this is basically Verlet lists. So what you'll do is you'll store a list of all the particles that are close enough to another particle such that they might be interacting for a given sort of interaction cutoff length. And by storing these lists of particles, you can reuse them over a certain number of simulation steps because you have this sort of temporal and spatial correlation while you're running it. And that makes things faster. And you build them typically using something called a link cell, where you sort of split your domain up into this little grid and you map particles into the grid, and you'll say, if we look around this one grid point, we can see everything that could potentially be close to it, and we can build these lists efficiently. And it all works fine, unless you're really looking at very, very large simulation domains. And at that point, sort of patterning everything in these link cells, even though lots of it might be empty because of this implicit solvent approach, you find that the memory use can skyrocket because it's actually cubic in the sort of simulation cell domain with the cutoff length. And even though you might be splitting up your domain into small packets, if you want to go really, really large in the overall simulation domain that you have, you can find that the memory use, even for a single particle system that doesn't have anything else in there, just one particle, whoosh, all of a sudden all your memory is getting eaten by stuff that is not useful. And so basically we're using these sorts of sparse memory structures where instead of patterning everything with these link cells, whether we need them or not, we're using sparse data structures to only put this stuff where we actually need it. And a little comparison that we have here, this is again with lamps because it's conventional and it's very straightforward and simple in the way that it works. As we make this simulation cell bigger, and L here is the actual sort of cubic dimension of the size, with a fixed interaction cutoff length, doing this Verlet algorithm, we have just constant memory use, regardless of pretty much how big the simulation domain is, whereas lamps starts to get very, very unhappy very, very quickly when you start running into these large simulation domains. And when you're dealing with these sorts of cellular systems, or possibly even tissue systems, which is the sort of blue sky idea that we like to push these simulations up to, this becomes a problem. You've really got to worry about all these background algorithms that you're making assumptions about that might not map onto really large simulation domains. There's also the issue of load balancing. So when you have this sort of uniform distribution of particles, which is the sort of thing that you might have in an all-atom simulation, because remember, all the little water molecules are in there, you've got roughly the same density throughout the simulation, you kind of get load balancing by default just by chopping up that simulation domain into roughly the same size volume chunks. Because if each of those volume chunks is assigned to a CPU and the density is the same all the way through, everybody's got pretty much the same amount of work to do, so you kind of get the load balancing for free. When you start removing the actual solvents and these implicit solvent systems, that's no longer the case. You no longer have this uniform particulate distribution, and because MD works on the basis of each of these CPU cores has to finish its local work before you can advance on to the next step, if any one of these cores is taking much too long compared to the other ones, you've just got this bottleneck. It doesn't matter how many simulation cores you're using on this machine, you're always limited by the slowest one, so trying to balance the load across everything is what's really going to let you scale up to these very large systems. Or do so effectively anyway. So we use space-filling curves, and the idea is that the space-filling curve itself is a sort of three-dimensional mathematical construct. So we can apply space-filling curve to the simulation domain that we're using, and the three-dimensional sort of curve indices, which is each of these little vertices in my three-dimensional rendering here, actually maps into a one-dimensional curve index. And by doing that, we can say, well, where are these particles, and where do they map into in terms of the curve? And if we map them all into curve indices, we can chop our curve up into sections that have roughly the same number of particles, and then each of our cores is responsible for a section of this curve. And by doing this, we can take these very irregular sort of distributions of particles that ordinarily might give you problems with domain decomposition, and it works much, much better. And you also get things like locality of data. Because the curve is sequential, you get locality in these sort of curve indices as you move along. By putting them onto adjacent cores on each of these CPU nodes, you kind of make sure that all of the data you might need is sat there on the same compute node, so you can use like shared memory and things to move the data around. So it's quite nice and effective in that way. The problem is, it's very dynamic. The load balancer itself is dynamic. It will periodically recalculate what the load should be. And because you don't have this nice distribution of little volumes, you have this really irregular looking curve that might have a very strange interfacial surface, and it has many different neighbors, and you don't necessarily know who they are in advance. You need to get a little bit clever with the communications, because I may know that I need to talk to the guy over there in terms of sending particle data, But he doesn't know to listen to me. So how do I actually notify some other random node in the network to expect information to be coming in? And we can use the same trick that we'll be using with the actual curve mapping to say, well, this particle goes into this place in the curve. We can look at the sort of local vicinity of that part of the curve. We can see who's nearby, who may need to know about this. And then we can use the sort of low-level network API, this DMAP stuff, to fire off messages to tell everybody who they should be listening to. And there's also the additional problem with using a space-filling curve. If you have a very large region of the simulation that's effectively empty, and it's only got a few particles in there, you might have a massive spatial volume assigned to a single CPU. And even though there's no work to do in there, you might have lots of adjacent CPUs around this volume trying to send you information. And that's going to be a bottleneck. Again, the communication overhead from actually sending all this information can get really painful. So what we basically do is we pre-filter it. Again, we send these sort of grid points to the potential destination node, and the destination node will tell you whether or not it's interested in anything that might be in those grid points, because that node itself knows where its particles are. So if I say, well, I might have particles in these regions, are you interested? The message comes back saying, no, ignore those, and that cuts down the communication overhead. So this lets us potentially assign these really big regions to a single core without really having problems with the communications. So we tried this out with a big system, and the video has not come out at all well here. But a 2 micron by 2 micron coarse-grained bilayer with these two sort of spherical micelles here, which is usually a real problem for load balancing. And we found that algorithmically, this thing scales up to about 260,000 CPU cores, pretty much linearly. So even for a very difficult system, this sort of Hilbert space-filling curve approach works really well. Problem is heterogeneous interactions in the same system. You can't assume that each of these little particles has the same computational cost in terms of the actual load balancing itself. So on the basis of us using coarse-grained models, and we don't really know in advance what sort of interactions might be going on, some of them might be very simple and computationally cheap. Some of them may be really expensive. You need to take this into account in the load balancer, so we time everything. We don't assume that everything has the same cost. And a brief example of why this is important is a simple two-phase system here, where the actual interaction cost between the different little beads in here is very different depending on whether it's like grey to grey or purple to purple. And you can see that even on a single sort of node here, where we've got rid of the communications entirely, because there is no communication, it's all shared memory, by taking into account what the actual runtime measured performance cost of all these things are, you can get a very significant, up to 70% increase in efficiency just by feeding this into the load balancer instead of using like the raw local particle densities. So there's a lot of tricks that you need to think about when you're running these coarse-grained simulations, purely because the actual computational costs can be very different compared to a conventional sort of simulation. So we're currently using this sort of a code for things like coarse-grained protein self-assemblies for these larger structures. We're doing coarse-grained membrane dynamics and remodeling of things like actin cytoskeletons on very large sort of scales, spatial scales. Some future enhancements, we're going to put the GPU calculations in there. We're very good at concentrating work onto a single compute node, so it makes sense to be using the GPUs at that point because I have low memory overheads. Need to get the communications working a little bit better. At the moment, the bottleneck is MPI. It just can't keep up with such nice scaling behavior that MPI starts to have problems and we're trying to send the data around. So that's something we need to take a quick look at. And we can do this with the DMAP libraries and PAMI and the Blue Genes and things like this. And obviously, acknowledgements. NSF, who've been helping to fund this through a sort of PRAC sub-award. The NCSA, who've given us facilities of Blue Waters, and it's a nice machine. Everybody else in the Voth group, special mention to this guy, James Farris-Dharma here, who's very smart and has some really interesting things to say about the overall sort of ultra-coarse-grained theory. And Robert Bruner, who's been an absolute star in terms of helping me out with some of the more technical aspects of what's going on with the networking that we actually needed to know to write this sort of software. So that's pretty much me, and hopefully I've not overrun too badly, so questions if there are any.